This is India's #1 news network, and you're watching News9. English news as it should be.
Good morning, you're watching News9. I'm Karthik Malhotra, and the big story that we're bringing to you this morning on the morning brief at 9, Donald Trump has finally dropped the tariff bomb on India. 25% tariff plus penalty on India's Russian imports. That's the big story that we're tracking for you. What are the political and the economic ramifications? More so, what are the options available to India, if any? That's what we will bring you on the morning brief at 9. Also, as markets open just about 15 minutes from now, investors brace for deep cuts as markets are likely to sink. We'll follow all that for you this morning on the morning brief at 9. Tariff is the big story that we're bringing to you this morning on the morning brief at 9. But first up, let's look at all the headlines that we're tracking for you. U.S. President Donald Trump announces 25% tariff on India starting August 1st, along with an additional penalty for continuing trade with Russia. The Indian government responds to 25% Trump tariff, says center is studying the implications of U.S. tariff and will take all necessary steps to secure national interest. Just hours after hitting India with 25% tariff, Trump announces major U.S. Pakistan oil deal while making a huge statement that Islamabad could one day export oil to India. U.S. has sanctioned 13 firms trading in Iranian petrochemicals, including 6 from India, as Trump administration targets 20 more entities tied to Iranian crude oil sector and blocks 10 vessels. Trump's 25% tariff on Indian goods from August 1st threatens Apple's iPhone export plans, raising industry concerns over rising costs, stalled expansion, and the future of India's role in global tech supply chains. And even as Trump and India continue to negotiate the trade deal, Donald Trump has announced a trade deal with South Korea, imposes 15% tariff, but secures $350 billion in U.S. investments, $100 billion in energy purchases, and full market access for American goods. And it's not just India. Trump signs executive order imposing 50% tariff on most Brazilian imports, citing political instability, but exempts key goods like aircraft, aluminium, and fertilizers. Meanwhile, Trump says U.S.-China trade talks moving along, expects a fair deal soon as negotiations progress in step with both sides. And in a corporate story, we're following up Tata Motors to acquire Italy's Iveco for $4.36 billion in its biggest ever deal, boosting commercial vehicle push ahead of demerger and gaining control of the Industrial Vehicles Corporation. U.S. President Donald Trump has made it official. India will be slapped with a 25% tariff on its exports to the U.S. starting August 1st. Now, this comes in light of no trade deal finalization between India and the U.S. just as yet. In a post on Truth Social, Trump didn't hold back. He slammed India's what he calls obnoxious trade practices, soaring import duties, and a military love affair with Russia. Now, Trump claimed that India has some of the highest tariffs in the world and the most strenuous, obnoxious, non-monetary barriers of any country. He also went on to say that India has always bought a vast majority of their military equipment from Russia and is Russia's largest buyer of energy, along with China, especially at a time when everyone wants Russia to stop the killing in Ukraine, adding, all things not good. It is important to note that India is indeed Russia's largest energy buyer. Russia takes up 35.4% of India's oil import, followed by Iraq, which stands at 19.2%, Saudi Arabia at 14.1%, and then the UAE at 10.1%. Now, ironically, this move comes just months after Trump and Prime Minister Modi promised to finalize a trade deal by the end of 2025, as well as ramp up bilateral trade between the two countries to $500 billion by the year 2030. But at this point, it seems the stalled trade talks has clearly rubbed the U.S. president the wrong way. Listen in.
Negotiating right now, and it's also BRICS. You know, they have BRICS, which is basically a group of countries that are anti the United States, and India is a member of that, if you can believe it. It's an attack on the dollar, and we're not going to let anybody attack the dollar. So it's partially BRICS, and it's partially the trade situation. It's the deficit. We had a tremendous deficit. So, as you know, Prime Minister Modi is a friend of mine, but they don't do very much business in terms of business with us. They sell a lot to us, but we don't buy from them. You know why? Because the tariff is so high. They have one of the highest tariffs in the world. Now, they're willing to cut it very substantially, but we'll see what happens. We're talking to India now. We'll see what happens. It doesn't matter too much whether we have a deal or whether we charge them a certain tariff. But you'll know at the end of this week. India was the highest, or just about the highest tariff nation in the world. One of the highest, 100 points, 150 points or percentages. So India was one of the highest in the world. They had won 175%, and higher than that. You know, who's another higher one is Canada. They've been charging our farmers 200%, 300%, 400% for years, and nobody did anything about it. But India is one of the highest, so we're going to see. We're negotiating with India right now.
So Trump calling India's tariffs and non-tariff barriers obnoxious, and still ending by saying that US and India are negotiating on a deal. However, White House economic advisor Kevin Hassett said that President Trump is frustrated with the progress made with India, but signaled there's still room for negotiation. Listen in.
I think that there's still hope for progress, and if the progress isn't what the president wants, then the deadline will kick in August. Well, I think that what's going to happen is that India is going to cut their prices to the U.S. In order to maintain their market share. That's what everybody else has been doing, and then they might reconsider their practices, which have led to this higher rate. And over time, I would guess that Indian firms will be onshoring production in the U.S., and Indians might even open their markets more to us so that we reconsider a future trade deal.
And responding to the tariff threats, the government of India said that they are committed to protecting and promoting the welfare of farmers, entrepreneurs as well as MSMEs. The statement added that the government will take all steps necessary to secure national interest. The Indian rupee also saw its steepest single-day fall in nearly 3 months on Wednesday after the announcement of the higher tariffs, sliding 61 paisa amid rising global uncertainty. The domestic currency closed at 87.42 against the US dollar, down from its previous close of 86.82. According to reports, the rupee opened weaker at 87.12 and continued to face pressure throughout the day yesterday. The crucial question then remains, is balanced, mutually beneficial agreement still within reach? We have a host of guests joining us this morning. Yuvika Singhal, economist at Quant Eco, Rishi Shah, partner and economist at the Economics Advisory at Grant Thornton. We also have Dr. Jayant Dasgupta, former Indian ambassador to the WTO, Barnik Chitran Matra, PE investor and managing partner at Chrysalis Equity Ventures. Yuvika and gentlemen, thank you so much for joining us this morning. Dr. Dasgupta, straight off the bat, what are the tools available with India now to avert these 25% tariffs on August 1st? Does India have an option?
I don't think really that India has an option. Of course, India is not going to walk out of any talks. India is going to negotiate till the very last moment and even beyond that. But the options available are not, very many, because India has mentioned its red lines very clearly, that it can't compromise on genetically modified food, especially corn and soya. And it can't open up its market to dairy products from the US, which incidentally, all of them are heavily subsidized. And the subsidy levels are much, much more than available to Indian farmers and dairy farmers. So the red lines have been drawn up.
Right. Yeah, go ahead, sir. Please finish your thought.
No, so the red lines have been drawn up, and it is for the U.S. to either accept or, not to accept it. But
You're right.
then
So
it will have definitely have repercussions on the ongoing trade talks, which the first tranche of which is supposed to be harvested by about October of this year.
that's right. So obviously the US administration does not seem to be in any mood of offering any concession to India when it comes to the farmer and dairy sector, and that seems to be the reason why this 25% tariff has been slapped. But Barnik, that's not the only reason, because Donald Trump's statement also very clearly states two other factors. One is the entire BRICS bloc, which Donald Trump seems to have a problem with, arguably on the threat of de-dollarization, and the other is India's energy and defense imports from Russia. Now, the question to you is that it's not just India that's part of BRICS, it's even China. It's not just India that imports energy from Russia, it's also China. Why no new tariff announcement on China? Rather, on the contrary, talks of a fair deal with China.
Yeah, so I think we should look at the developments of the last 24 hours as a negotiating tactic to force a framework deal before the self-imposed August 1 deadline by the American authorities.
Right.
I think if you look at what deals have been announced, the Americans are looking for four broad areas of support from countries like India, right? They're looking for a low tariff access for their goods. They're looking for complete reduction or elimination of non-tariff barriers. But even more important, they're looking for countries to buy energy and defense from the US and also commit to invest hundreds of billions of dollars into the country. So there's a four-part formula, it seems, the Trump administration has, as you look at the deals either with the European Union or with Japan or South Korea. And if you look at what's gone on the last 24 hours, it's a little bit of posturing to get India to agree to all four components of this. By the way, the reason why there is no mention of China is because there are negotiations ongoing with China, and
ongoing with India as well, Barnik, and that's why I'm trying to compare the two, because there also seems to be some potential political messaging here, because trade talks are on with India, trade talks are on with China as well. So fair deal with China coming up, no deal with India, 25% tariff doesn't sound fair.
No, no. You have to understand that this is driven more by optics and politics than what's fair on paper, right? The Trump administration last month already announced a breakthrough with China, right, where they announced that there's a framework in place. If you look at the fine print of what got announced, I think it's just a continuing agreement. I think with India, what they are looking for is the announcement of a framework which they'll call a deal. So I don't think we should get overly worried about it. I think the 25% tariff, which will kick in from August 1, I don't think American industry, the American markets have reacted to any of that. I don't think they expect a lot of impact on either side. So I think we should just be patient, stick to our ground, and as per our internal deadlines to get a framework done by September end, as long as important deadlines on agriculture, dairy are not crossed, right? We will have something. So let's not get worried about it. I think those are two completely separate discussions. Sure. I think it's also a little bit of posturing by talking about BRICS and India, because that also sends a message to China. But they're a little bit careful to call out China, because the Chinese tend to be tougher negotiators and they have a history of walking away from trade negotiations if you do a lot of public posturing.
All right, Yuvika, next question to you. And, we are again looking at everything that has happened over the last 12 hours or so. And another thing which does not seem to augur well for India is the fact that there is an oil deal that US has announced with Pakistan. Now, and at some point expects India to buy oil which is refined and produced in Pakistan. Is there a political messaging that you sense, or do you think this is just Donald Trump, pure play economics? There are oil reserves in Pakistan. Let's go and drill, baby, drill in that terror harboring nation.
Honestly, I think it's hard to say, because there's a lot of news, there's a lot of comments that are flowing in, and we've seen heightened commentary in the last 12 hours. But I think it's also disappointing at the same time to see that the messaging has not worked in favor of India. And this is despite 5 rounds of negotiation happening over the course of the last 6 months. We were hopeful that something material would stem out of these negotiations, largely because India was left out of the 14 list of countries that the US had put higher tariffs on, that was announced on July 7. But somehow we are disappointed on every front. So not just the tariff level is high at 25%, which remains the same that was announced on the Liberation Day, but there's also a degree of unspecified penalty that has come in on India. And then all these complications about, underlying themes like energy and defense, which tend to be sticky for India from a geopolitical or a political standpoint. So instead of rushing into making sweeping conclusions, I think we are still in a wait and watch mode because the negotiations are still very much on the table. And I would rather view the headline announcements that Trump has made on tariffs as more of a negotiation tactic at this point in time. We have seen this in the past. His style of deal making generally does rest on this kind of negotiation tactics being brought to the fore before any kind of big messaging is done. He's done that with EU, he's done that with Japan, and probably this is just some little bit of pressuring that India will have to withstand to get to a middle ground, possibly over the course of the next few months.
All right, Rishi Shah, what could that middle ground be? Because India is also pretty clear, and let's look at the response that has been released by the Indian government, saying that protection of farmers' interests, protecting our entrepreneurs and MSMEs is of paramount importance. But the fact that some middle ground will have to be reached in order to avoid the 25% tariff, albeit it could be just a softening and not a doing away with tariffs altogether, like we've seen with EU and with Japan as well as South Korea now. But the question really is, what can that middle ground now really be? Rishi Shah.
Sorry. Yeah,
if you could
I was just
yourself.
saying
Yeah,
that, I believe that that's still a very big question, and it's a difficult time to be answering that. There are some very crucial points that are getting stuck, and beyond that, there is the geopolitical angle of it, that, what kind of trade does India have with with Russia, China, and other parties as well. At this point, I wouldn't really like to hazard a guess, but like I said earlier as well, that there are changing geopolitical situations, and I think the trade deal will reflect what kind of position we'll be in a few months. I don't really see this as the end of things, and moving forward, a lot will change. Trade deals generally take a few years to materialize, generally in the vicinity of 3 to 4 years. So I don't really see any changes happening in a hurry.
Okay, no changes happening in a hurry, but Dr. Dasgupta, what is the long-term view? Because if India does not relent on agriculture and dairy sector, then pretty much we are saying that interim deal, the 6th round of negotiations on the 25th of August are also likely to fall flat.
No, 25th of August is independent of what happens on the 1st of August.
That's right, sir.
But then it will definitely, there will be an overhang of what happens on the 1st of August. So President Trump has to be conscious of that. And I think I would like to emphasize one point which came out in the statement that the Commerce Ministry issued yesterday. It said that India is looking forward to a balanced deal. And I think this is something which has been lost sight of by the Trump administration, because it is only take on the side of the administration that they just want to have more and more access and threaten India with higher and higher tariffs.
Right.
Now the issue is India also wants reciprocity. It has to be a two-way deal, and reciprocity means that the Trump administration has to offer tariff lowering below the pre-Trump levels. That is what was existing in December. And for that, they need a trade promotion authority, which they don't have.
Right.
So even if they give an assurance in the agreement in writing that they will do it in 6 months, they will get the trade promotion authority and reduce the tariffs, or else everything goes back to, there is a snapback provision that everything goes back to the original levels.
Right.
So that is something I think is also a sticking point, and it will be scrutinized by everybody in India, whether India is getting any reciprocity.
Right. Well, many would argue in the US, especially on the Republican side, that what Trump is doing is reciprocity and doing a tit for tat on what he calls higher than anybody else in the world tariffs that India imposes. But Yuvika, final question to you. What really seems to be the economic fallout? Let's assume for one moment that the deal or the talks, even on the 25th of August, don't work out. And if India has to deal with this blow of 25% tariff, what is the kind of economic fallout that we are looking at in about 30 seconds, please?
I think clearly there will be a fallout for businesses and traders, largely because you will have to probably look at tariff-driven higher costs. And remember, any kind of trade globally does depend on cost competitiveness at the end of the day, and the comparative advantage that costs, allow exporters or importers. So I think we'll be probably looking at higher costs, some of which will have to be internalized, some of it will have to be passed on, and this is bound to change the flow of trade geographically, products. We'll have to go back to the drawing board and see where we can innovate, find newer markets, and see how things go from here on. But definitely not a positive. Definitely traders and exporters will have a hard time trying to internalize all the costs which come in with the 25% plus some kind of a penalty that we are looking at in terms of the tariff level.
All right. And finally, before I let you all go, Barnik, India's response, let's pull that up and just look at the language that India has used in its response. What would you call it? The fact that India is saying that it will continue to act in national interest, it will protect its farmers, its entrepreneurs, its MSMEs. Is this defiance or is this a measured response as per your reading?
No, I think this is a fairly measured response and consistent with India's stand globally with all countries we are trying to do trade with. I think agriculture, dairy are definite areas in which protection will continue. In fact, all countries, including the US, does it for their own farmers. I think there is a drive to protect the smaller industries and traders, and more importantly, market access for labor-intensive industries from India to export is also important. So what I see from the Ministry of Commerce is this is consistent with the Indian stance, not only with American authorities, but with all countries we're trying to do trade with or trade deals with. I think the Americans know this also very clearly. I think the issue now is about optics and what can we get to a point where President Trump can declare victory without the Indians giving too much away. I think that's the strategy other countries are actually taking on. I think even the European Union, even though the administration claimed victory across several dimensions, the European Commission later clarified that a lot of the things were more intent than commitments. So I think it's all about getting to a point at which the Americans can claim an optical victory without giving away too much about our stance. And I think this will happen. I don't think this will continue for too long. I think there's at one level, since it takes 3-4 years to operationalize such deals, with the midterms next November, you will have a different house and then a new presidency in 3 years.
Right.
I don't think India should be too worried about what will happen because some of these things will just change. But I think it's all about how do we get somewhere where the Americans believe that they've got either a framework, which they call a deal, so that they can stop calling India out unilaterally as they are doing.
All right, well, let's leave it at that. There is some optimism here, at least if we were to believe what Barnik is saying this morning, and honestly not too much negativity even in the Indian stock markets. One was expecting deeper cuts today, but markets are down just about 0.75% or so in trade. But with that, I'll thank all my guests here. But coming up on the other side, we will bring all the action on Dalal Street. Remember, markets have tanked about 0.75%. Most stocks, barring just a few sectors, are looking red on the Nifty 50 heat map. We'll decode all that for you on the other side of the break. You're watching Morning Brief at 9.
Sir, try berry pulao. Too good. Good, no? Hey, why are you giving him such looks? Ignore tips and use your own mind before you order. Lots of people give unsolicited stock tips. It can be dangerous. Study the company and the risk associated. Invest only after analyzing.
एसोसिएट स्पॉन्सर डायना प्रीमियम ब्यूटी सोप, पहली झलक करे खूबसूरत।
पढ़ता है, खेलता है, झूलता उछलता है, दौड़ता कभी कभी दौड़ कराता है, आगे आगे बढ़ता है इंडिया, अमूल दूध पीता है इंडिया।
खूबसूरत सी तुम कोई चिंता करो, भरोसा खड़ा है तुम्हारे, तुम नया कल बनाते रहो।
जब कोई हमारी बाकी चिंताओं को संभाल लेता है तो हम कर पाते हैं खूबसूरत सी कोई चिंता। टाटा कैपिटल में हम आपकी हर फाइनेंशियल चिंता को संभाल लेते हैं ताकि आप करें सिर्फ खूबसूरत चिंताएं। Go condoms?
It's over there.
क्या ये डिफरेंट साइजेस में आता है?
Actually, sir, size matter नहीं करता.
तो फिर क्या मैटर करता है?
The hardness
Of the condom.
of what's inside.
For the first time ever, presenting Hard Rock Gel, the hardness gel for men.
अब फ्री हर स्कोर कॉन्डम्स के 10 पैक के साथ।
फिर ये डुगडुगी गई कहाँ? पापा के साथ साथ सारे सपने भी चले गए। पर अपने बच्चों के सपनों के साथ ऐसा कुछ नहीं होने देना। वो कैसे? पहले से लाइफ इंश्योरेंस का टर्म प्लान ले रखा है। बड़े भैया।
सपनों को रखो सुरक्षित टर्म प्लान के साथ। सबसे पहले लाइफ इंश्योरेंस।
Welcome back. You're watching News 9. Markets have opened as expected in the red this morning, though the cuts have not been as deep as many had anticipated after the announcement of 25% tariff plus penalty on India starting August 1st by U.S. President Donald Trump. We have our three regular market guests joining us this morning on this very important news day. Rohit Srivastav, founder and market strategist, India Charts, Mohit Gang, co-founder and CEO, Moneyfront, and Feroz Aziz, joint CEO, Anand Rathi. Gentlemen, thank you so much for being here with us this morning. Rohit, let me begin by asking you, markets were down, the broad indices were down about 0.75% or so when markets opened. Now, some buying action down just about 0.5% from yesterday's close. Were investors prepared for this 25% tariff to come in?
Well, psychologically, probably not, because there was a lot of hope building up that we would get a deal better than 25%. So definitely, if the number getting announced is with no change from what we heard in April, it is sort of a short-term negative surprise. But at the same time, the entire month of July, since the dates got pushed ahead, we've also, taken a back foot on the market on the fear that, will the deal get through? Will it not get through? So the market had priced in some of the pain, but it's always a negative reaction because we also priced in that it would not be as bad as it's sounding right now. But what I also hear this morning, President Trump say that we are still negotiating, which means this is not the final number. This is just what he's put out so that we complete some kind of final negotiation by the 1st of August. So let's see how it goes, I think. But for the time being, it's a knee-jerk reaction. It's what the market is doing.
Knee-jerk reaction, Feroz, but not as much of a pain as one would have thought it is likely to be this morning. But of course, energy stocks continue to be in focus, especially given the Russian oil import and the penalties that are likely to be imposed on India. And add to that, Iranian imports also coming under Donald Trump's radar. So what are you making of the energy sector this morning?
Karthik, I think firstly on the market overall, I personally think that when it comes to a certain news is not important as much as when it comes. When the news comes, if you've already gone through 11 months of time correction and you're about 5.86% below the peak of September 24, then you've already spent 11 months of earnings growth. Last year's earnings growth of Nifty was 11%, reported only 6.5%. With Nifty, NSE reports only 6.5% because of the 4 constituents which changed. So you have got 11% earnings growth of the current 50 constituents of Nifty. 0.1. You've already gone through a 5% of price correction, 5.8%. You've already gone through 11 months of price time correction. And when it comes to trade deal, any new variable, the second part of how a market reacts is if there's a new variable is when you get a knee-jerk reaction. Like when on 7th of April, when Trump said the same thing, Nifty opened almost about 1,600 points lower. That's because a new variable comes. So whenever new variables come is when you get substantive reactions, and markets have already priced in the current situation, and the markets are giving a message that you tell us what the final is, then we will decide. Your bullying tactics or to and fro's of negotiations don't ideally be in the open. This is the first time a trade deal is being discussed so much in the open. So I personally think the markets are sensible and they'll know what negotiating tactics are, and that's what is happening.
All right. And specifically on the energy stocks this morning, given the fact that a new variable of penalty on Russian imports comes in, Feroz, what are you making of that?
I personally think that those, of course, like in the morning, also some sanctions on certain companies were spoken of too, were disclosed. I think the energy sector is represented in the form in Nifty about 9.6%, and NSE 500 about 7%. So it's not a main sector, but I personally think you have to be very, very, very careful to be in this sector currently. And I think I would not get into the sector seeing it as buying opportunity because the new variables need to emerge. I think the geopolitical uncertainty on energy sector is one of the most overweighing. So I would not see that as buying opportunity, any correction. And I think oil and gas have had a very bad couple of years in terms of earnings as well, to be more specific.
All right. Mohit gang, thanks for waiting patiently. I'll come to you in just a minute. But first, again, to Rohit Srivastava, who's on a timer and has to leave. Rohit, in case there is a better deal that India is able to stitch for itself, definitely not by August 1st, but at least in the week of August 25th, when the 6th round of negotiations happen, and if India does get a better deal for itself, what's the kind of upside that investors should brace for if they are looking at these corrections or these dips, whatever you call them, as an opportunity to buy?
So, when you end up pricing in the worst, then anything that, turns positive from there is going to push the markets much higher. If you specifically ask me how much higher, I will say that don't rule out an all-time high in the market as we head into September. Because it will look better than what it looks right now. You have to also put in perspective the positioning. So what really happens when news flow turns positive and then you look at the positioning is that you have the second highest short position in index futures by foreign institutional investors right now. So that sort of is the setup. They've probably sold heavily and hedged heavily into this event. That anything positive would force a lot of short covering. And that is why I'm saying that don't be surprised if, slight positive and you're at an all-time high.
All right. Thank you, Rohit Srivastava, for joining us and with those inputs. But Mohit Kang, let me flip that question to you and say that in case India is not able to stitch up a deal, what is the downside that we are looking at?
Thank you, Karthik. Thank you for having me on the show. But look, I think honestly, the downside is already there for all of us to see on the screen today. So my sense is if we are not able to stitch a deal, I think markets have pretty much factored in. And as I kind of agree with what Feroz said, market has kind of factored it in a time correction, which we have seen over last 1 year, right? So obviously there are many other factors to it that Indian earnings have not grown substantially and so on and so forth. But I think the lingering thought of a trade deal has kept the market on tenterhooks, and markets always tend to factor in the worst possible scenarios. So on any news from here on can only be add on more positive to the market. And we have seen a lot of taco trade happening across the globe, Karthik. So I'll not be surprised if Trump always chickens out kind of plays again in the market, and we're able to figure out something, some way out of it. And I'm pretty sure that diplomatic channels will work overtime to figure out something. And any news from here on can only be positive to my mind.
All right. Well, we don't know whether Trump will chicken out or not, but we know for a fact, Feroz, that Fed Chair Jerome Powell has not chickened out and he has not cut interest rates. And now that is something which is unlikely to augur well again for India's IT sector. And this IT sector, of course, not just quarterly earnings, but for a while now has been under pressure. Is there any recovery in sight? Because investors tend to be losing money on IT stocks day after day.
I think, Karthik, there's a lot of cleansing in the ownership of IT which is happening. There is some degree of unwinding of the whole weights reduction in the passives of IT stocks.
All right.
What happens is if there's underperformance, there is lesser weightage. If there's lesser weightage, more money goes out, then there's more underperformance. That's called the vicious cycle of passive unwinding or passive winding. There's some stock which get the headwind of passive weights reducing. So IT is going through that transformatory ownership change. That's point one. That's why it is 20-25% lower. Nifty IT has about 10 stocks. They've done great earnings last year. They've done about 10.6% earnings. So I think that will turn around. So if you look at Nifty IT over 3-year periods, you will at least see a 4-5% compounded alpha or excess return over Nifty. That's my take. Now coming to the interest rates of the US. US interest rates being higher, to my mind, is a very good thing for sectors which are dependent on dollar depreciation. So what happens is when currency interest rates are different, interest rate parity makes sure that Indian rupee depreciates faster. Now we have had RBI reducing rates. You've brought back repo to almost 5.5 from 6.5 after 2.5 years of lull from June 22. And here the US Fed is not reducing interest rates. So the interest rate parity is favoring the currency of India, which was one of the challenges of rupee depreciation. So I think there is some give, there is some take. Of course, IT as a sector has a weight of about 11.2 in Nifty. So it's a heavyweight sector, more than 10% weight. So what I personally think I would be a contrarian on the IT sector from a 2-3 year perspective on an alpha excess return basis.
All right, Firoz, thanks for that. Mohit Gang, final question to you. What should be the strategy for investors, retail investors, salaried people who are looking at these corrections in markets right now? Would you now call it that at least all the negative variables are out of the equation and everything has been priced in and this would be the best buy on dip opportunity, or do you still believe that the worst could potentially be yet to come?
Look, Karthik, markets are built on the premise that every quarter you will have new variables coming into market, whether it's geopolitical, whether it's related to macros, you will keep having newer and newer variables. So today, as it looks like, we are pretty much done with the variables, except that the RBI MPC is due, right? So other than that, I think all the variables are out there, factored in pretty much. And it seems like markets have taken the worst in their stride. And perhaps from a retail investor point of view, I sense is we should continue to build their positions, though gradually. I don't think so it's a time to jump on with heavy lump sum investments right now. Perhaps an STP staggered approach is still the best approach in the market. And I continue to believe that this year perhaps might be a year of consolidation where people have to build their positions and then brace up for the next move whenever it happens, whether it be next financial year or maybe a year after that.
All right. Well, let's leave it at that. Mohit Gang, Firoz Aziz, always a pleasure having you with us here on News9. Thank you for all your inputs. And we will slip into another short break. But coming up, what is the political economic ramification of Trump's tariffs? We'll have Srinath Sridharan, policy researcher and corporate advisor, joining us, as well as News9's input editor Brijesh Pandey joining us on the other side of the break. You're watching Morning Brief at 9.
एसोसिएट स्पॉन्सर एंकर टूथपेस्ट, नए जमाने की नई सुरक्षा।
पढ़ता है, खेलता है, झूलता उछलता है, दौड़ता कभी कभी दौड़ कराता है, आगे आगे बढ़ता है इंडिया, अमूल दूध पीता है इंडिया।
मुझसे नहीं हो गया। उनको देख रहे हो? क्या संगीत तक ये स्टेप सीख पाएंगे? ये खूबसूरत चिंता आप करिए। शादी के पर्सनल लोन की चिंता हम संभाल लेंगे। With EMI starting at 94 rupees per day and tenure up to 7 years.
Go condoms? It's over there.
क्या ये डिफरेंट साइजेस में आता है?
Actually, sir, size matter नहीं करता।
तो फिर क्या मैटर करता है?
The hardness
Of the condom.
of what's inside.
For the first time ever, presenting Hard Rock Gel, the hardness gel for men.
अब फ्री हर स्कोर कॉन्डम्स के 10 पैक के साथ।
Welcome back. You're watching Morning Brief at 9. We are still with the tariff bomb that Donald Trump has dropped, 25% plus penalty on India starting August 1st. Now, what are the political ramifications likely to be? And are there any options as India finds itself caught between a rock and a hard place? Are there any options that India can exercise? First up, let's bring the political reactions already out there and those expected later in Parliament today. I have my colleague Brijesh Pandey, input editor News9, joining us this morning. Brijesh, there's a question that Srinath and I were discussing yesterday. Perhaps you would have the answer to that. How will Raga react to MAGA?
Well, I think Raga has already reacted, and ever since this tariff announcement was made by America, the Congress party has held a couple of press conferences. They have started tweeting about it, saying that how Prime Minister's friendship with Trump is going to bring, the entire pharmaceutical industry and other industries to a standstill. He says that, it is the slogan called Ab Ki Baar Trump Sarkar, and the way Prime Minister had aligned himself to the political fortune of Donald Trump. The result of that close friendship is something which the entire India is going to pay a huge cost for. The Congress has already started started hitting out at the government, saying this is a clear-cut result of a failed diplomacy of Indian Prime Minister Narendra Modi. So I think, today, tomorrow, we're going to see a lot of fireworks as far as this 25% tariff is concerned. And, one constant was SIR, on which, the opposition was boycotting and forcing adjournment after adjournment in both houses of parliament. I think 25% tariff will be added to the other cause. So it's going to be a very stormy session throughout the day as far as both houses of parliament is concerned.
Yeah, I think walkouts and adjournments is what is one of the likely outcomes, Brijesh. But let's leave it at that. Thank you for your input this morning. Srinath, let me bring you in. Are there any options available with India at this moment? Can India really now go ahead and negotiate? Maybe on the negative, but on the farm and dairy sector. Is that even on the table as far as India is concerned?
Karthik, hi. I think the challenge is farm sector is not on the table at all. And it's never been on the table for a very, very long time. So the reality is, if whichever party is ruling the nation would have the same premise that you cannot compromise sovereignty by giving up on agriculture, farm, dairy and other sectors. I think this is also, let's face it, this is what we call the transactional politics, diplomacy. And in that, this is only the first round. And this is a hard negotiation tactic of the US. So it is not all over. And as we speak about the bilateral trade, what are the other sectors that we can probably give in? The challenge that if India really were to step up its complete regulations on, let's say, data and digital, and let's say if you were to bring in rules to say that any data has to be localized and stored in India, I think we are going to have a little more interesting bargaining ahead. But the challenge also is that we have a complete American monopoly on data and digital. Our servers data is stored on American AWS, which is an American company. If you look at the Indian payment system, nearly 85% of all payment flows of our UPI goes through 3 brands which are predominantly owned by the American entities. So it also was going to be a wake-up call for India that can we reform ourselves, let's say in the next 2 to 3 years, in terms of ease of doing business, in terms of looking inward to be far more self-reliant, at least in technology space. But let's come back to this particular trade tariff. The reality is we still have conversations, bilateral trade talks happening. And I think any political conversation saying that we have given in and given up, all of that, I think it's too premature. I think we'll have to wait and watch. There will be, in the diplomacy, we are seeing one big change in the Trump regime, that Truth Social seems to be far more accepted than even a White House press communique.
Right.
So that nature of diplomacy, I think it will be interesting. And I think I would support what the Indian government has very tacitly and very subtly said that, hey, we will hold on and we will talk. A lot of these will be backroom conversations from now till whatever is the final outcome.
All right. And I also want to understand from you what seems to be the political messaging here, Srinath, given the fact that Donald Trump, on the same day as he announced this 25% tariff on India, also says that talks with China are still on and what he calls a fair deal is in the making. Well, that seemed to be the stated intention again for the deal with India. But no tariff on China announced, a tariff of 25% plus penalty announced on India, given the fact that China and India are both part of BRICS and both are also importers of Russian energy. What seems to be the political messaging? And not just that, in fact, a few hours later, an oil deal with Pakistan. So, I mean, this entire friendship and this bonhomie comes into question between Donald Trump and Prime Minister Modi.
See, I think let's not mistake the US for so many decades. Let's not mistake friendship with what they actually end up doing. I mean, they want power, they want to be the global power, and the reality is they are a global hard power. India, for all its our efforts and claims, we are still a middle power and we have a long way to go to catch up globally. But in that nature of things, what Trump has now shown is China, Pakistan, whatever, if I have to break friendship that India has with somebody else, or if I were to make India an enemy's is a friend, I mean, I think strategically he's doing that. Pakistan, if you remember, he said that he brokered the ceasefire, then he said his family got into a deal to do cryptocurrencies exchange in Pakistan and all of that. Right. It clearly shows that the governance model, I mean, see, I want to be very clear here. A lot of times the Westerners think the governance across political sphere, across corporate governance in India seems to be lesser is what they claim. Look what's happening in the greatest democracy and the largest superpower in the world. I mean, the institutions seem broken. All the commitments, including, let's say, multilateralism, completely broken. The tariffs are actually anti-multilateralism. Where is the conversation about dealing bilaterally rather than actually doing multilateralism? So I think the rule of the games are changed under Trump. And let's not forget, any head of state is a politician ultimately. They have to win the subsequent elections. And that's exactly what he's doing. So from his point of view, he's doing what is good for America or what is good for his politics. And it's hurting us.
Right. Well, Srinath, of course, I think the question that now needs to be answered, and we will hopefully get an answer to that, is India's politics going to trump India's economic interests? And that is something that, of course, time will only tell. But thank you so much for joining us here this morning.
Thank you.
And before we slip into another short break, let's look at the other global headlines that we're tracking for you. U.S. President Donald Trump says trade talks with China progressing well, expects a fair agreement soon as negotiators work towards an August 12th deadline following earlier interim deals. Trump orders sweeping 50% tariff on Brazil, imposes sanctions on the judge overseeing Jair Bolsonaro's coup trial, escalating tensions with Latin America's biggest economy. Donald Trump also unveils a new trade pact with South Korea, including a 15% tariff on imports while securing major commitments on U.S. energy exports as well as investments into the U.S. U.S. Federal Reserve keeps interest rates unchanged, resisting calls from President Donald Trump to cut borrowing costs even as internal divisions emerge over future policy direction. In other news, Canadian Prime Minister Mark Carney joins the UK and France in backing recognition of a Palestinian state at the UN this September, only if the Palestinian Authority commits to reform and exclude Hamas from the 2026 elections. German giants Mercedes-Benz and Adidas warn of a $650 million hit from U.S. tariffs. Mercedes cuts its sales outlook while Adidas holds off on new plans amid deepening trade friction. Chinese factory activity shrinks more than expected in the month of July, marking a fourth consecutive monthly decline as trade talks with the U.S. drag on. Samsung's second quarter operating profit drops by more than half as U.S. export restrictions on AI chips to China dent sales. And tech giant Microsoft posts better than expected profits driven by strong demand in its cloud computing and artificial intelligence divisions. We'll be back with more stories on the other side of the break. You're watching News9.
एसोसिएट स्पॉन्सर एंकर टूथपेस्ट नए जमाने की नई सुरक्षा.
Massive announcement coming in from U.S. President Donald Trump. He's announced a 25% tariff regime for India along with a penalty.
Something which is very expected from Donald Trump is unpredictability, uncertainty, and the erratic announcement of the tariffs.
Of course, it will be a big jolt to our export-oriented industry. That is for sure.
With monsoon session of the parliament on, Donald Trump going on record to say we'll penalize India for having relationship with both Russia and China is not going to augur very well for the sitting government.
If that pause button is not hit, then India is going to have to deal with this 25% plus X tariff. The big question now is find X. What is that X going to be?
back. You're watching News9. U.S. President Donald Trump said on Wednesday that trade discussions with China are progressing well and he expects the two nations to reach a fair agreement. Negotiators from both sides are working against an August 12th deadline to finalize a sustainable tariff accord following interim agreements reached in May as well as June.
We're moving along with China. We're doing fine with China. I think it's going to work out very well. We're right in step. I think we're going to have a very fair deal with China. Thank you. Moving along with China. We're doing fine with China. I think it's going to work out very well. We're right in step. I think we're going to have a very fair deal with China. Thank you.
And U.S. President Donald Trump on Wednesday also announced a sweeping trade deal with South Korea, setting a 15% tariff rate on imports from the country while securing major commitments on U.S. investments as well as energy exports. In a Truth Social post, Trump said Seoul had agreed to invest $350 billion in the U.S. and buy $100 billion worth of American energy products. He also said South Korea would completely open its market to U.S. goods, including vehicles and agriculture, calling it a tremendous deal that strengthens economic ties between the allies. And Trump also on Wednesday signed another executive order to enforce a 50% tariff on most Brazilian imports, escalating trade tensions with Latin America's largest economy. Now, this move follows a July 9th warning to Brazilian President Lula da Silva and cites economic instability and the ongoing prosecution of former Brazilian President Jair Bolsonaro. The Trump administration invoked a 1977 emergency economic law to impose the latest tariff, saying Brazil's internal politics posed a threat to U.S. interests. However, several key Brazilian imports will be exempt from the 50% baseline tariff, including aircraft, aluminium, wood pulp, fertilizers, and energy products. And staying with stories from the U.S., Trump on Wednesday also announced a sweeping new health initiative aimed at modernizing digital medical records. The project, developed in collaboration with tech giants like Amazon, Google, Apple, and OpenAI, will make it easier for patients to access their own health data and share it with healthcare providers. Listen in.
For decades, America's healthcare networks have been overdue for a high-tech upgrade, and that's what we're doing. The existing systems are often slow, costly, and incompatible with one another. But with today's announcement, we take a major step to bring healthcare into the digital age, something that is absolutely vital. You got to do it. The U.S. Treasury has taken in $150 billion from tariffs, and we'll be adding about $200 billion next month for totals that nobody's ever seen before, frankly.
And the U.S. Federal Reserve has left interest rates unchanged on Wednesday, dimming hopes of a rate cut in September. Now, Fed Chair Jerome Powell emphasized that the central bank's focus on fighting inflation rather than lowering borrowing costs as urged by Donald Trump. Listen in to the Fed Chair.
Today, the Federal Open Market Committee decided to leave our policy interest rate unchanged. We believe that the current stance of monetary policy leaves us well positioned to respond in a timely way to potential economic developments. Despite elevated uncertainty, the economy is in a solid position. The unemployment rate remains low, and the labor market is at or near maximum employment.
And now on to Wall Street. Stocks edged modestly higher as investors assessed Federal Reserve's rate decision, buoyed by stronger than expected second quarter GDP data, but underlying details suggested that the economy may be losing momentum, keeping investors cautious. Take a look.
U.S. stocks ended well off earlier highs on Wednesday, with the Dow losing nearly 0.4%, the S&P 500 dipping fractionally, and the Nasdaq notching a slight gain. The Federal Reserve concluded its July policy meeting on Wednesday by keeping interest rates unchanged as expected. But for the first time in more than 30 years, two members of the voting committee dissented, with both seeking an immediate rate cut. Nancy Tengler is CEO and Chief Investment Officer at Laffer Tengler Investments.
I actually think it's kind of refreshing. The groupthink at the Fed has always bothered me, where it's a unanimous vote every meeting. I think what it's setting up is a debate for the future, and maybe around Jackson Hole, but certainly. There are many, at least in my position as investors, professional investors, that think the Fed should begin cutting. They are laser focused on tariffs. that isn't even really their mandate, though they're tying it to inflation. But we think that there's a number of reasons that the Fed should be thinking about cutting.
Fed Chair Jerome Powell, however, chilled expectations of a September rate cut by saying it was too soon to tell whether the economic data would support such a move. Later in the day, markets turned their focus to earnings from two members of the Magnificent Seven. Shares of Meta soared 10% in extended trading after the Facebook parent forecast third-quarter revenue well above Wall Street expectations and raised the lower end of its capital expenses forecast for the year. And shares of Microsoft rose more than 7% in extended trading after handily beating Wall Street's revenue expectations. The tech giant reported blockbuster growth at its Azure cloud computing business and growing returns from its massive bets on AI. Investor focus now turns to Amazon and Apple ahead of their earnings results on Thursday.
And that's all we have for you on this edition of the Morning Brief at 9. Thank you so much for watching. News continues right here on News9.
एसोसिएट स्पॉन्सर एंकर टूथपेस्ट नए जमाने की नई सुरक्षा.
Massive announcement coming in from U.S. President Donald Trump. He's announced a 25% tariff regime for India along with a penalty.
Something which is very expected from Donald Trump is unpredictability, uncertainty, and the erratic announcement of the tariffs.
Of course, it will be a big jolt to our export-oriented industry. That is for sure.
With monsoon session of the parliament on, Donald Trump going on record to say we'll penalize India for having relationship with both Russia and China is not going to augur very well for the sitting government.
If that pause button is not hit, then India is going to have to deal with this 25% plus X tariff. And I think the big question now is find X. What is that X going to be?
What is to the nines? In literal terms, it's perfection.